Satya, thank you. Microsoft's market cap is over 1.2 trillion, and depending on what day of the week it is, you're either the world's most valuable company or you're not. And we're going to come back to talk about the business at the end. But I thought we'd begin with the other thing that you talk quite a lot about, which is the idea in a sense that that market cap doesn't matter as much as other things. You want to be measured by them. And there were two particular areas I wanted to come on to, which is firstly equality and AI, and then this idea of free trade and all these economists who've been back looking at him. But I wondered, firstly, when you take this idea that market cap is not really the way to measure you, why not? And what would you rather be measured by?
I mean, first of all, John, it's fantastic to be here. I mean, when I say market cap's not the way to measure things is, for us as a platform company, in fact, I think one of the things with digital technology companies, there's a big misunderstanding even of the different business models. I think that there needs to be more awareness that platform companies and aggregators are two very different types of companies. For example, in our case, unless and until we are creating more value above us, we are not going to have a business. So in some sense, celebrating just our scale just makes no sense, because you have to sort of celebrate the scale that you're enabling and thereby having a business. So that's why I do feel that as a company, we need to stay grounded on what's the value we have really created in pretty much every country, every community we operate in. Unless and until there are small businesses that are more productive, large multinationals in those countries and communities that are becoming much more competitive globally, public sector becoming more efficient, or health outcomes, education outcomes getting better because of whatever we have been able to do. We want to have a market cap, so to speak.
Can we begin with the first thing I mentioned, which was the AI inequality? I mean, you've talked quite a lot about the idea are these new forms of technology making the world less equal, and what you can do about it? And I suppose the first question is, do you think AI is positive or negative on the issue of equality at the moment?
I mean, there are a couple of ways I come at it. 5% of the world GDP is tech spend today. It's expected to be, 10% by 2030. So it's going to double. So the way I look at it is what's happening in the other 90%. And whether it's AI, whether it's cloud computing, whatever digital input, is it as a factor of production helping broadly improve the economy's productivity is, I think, the real question of our times. Because it's interesting, when you look at what Robert Gordon and others have written, they talk about, in fact, how, in spite of all of the advances in information technology, it's not showing up in the productivity stats at all. In fact, I feel very proud because Robert Gordon sort of talks about the last time information technology did show up in the productivity stats was the PC revolution. So to me, being able to sort of really think about how can technology make its way so that there's broad sectoral growth is the most important thing. And AI is, in today's world, when you think about, it's not software, it's actually how data writes software. That's AI, right? I mean, AI is just, in fact, that next level of exponential capability in software, in where your own data can generate the software for you. And that's going to be the key ingredient.
But do you worry that what's happening is that the proceeds of this are going to the people in this room, to people who, creative, clever people, obviously like everyone in this room, rather than the mass of the world's population?
It's an interesting question, right? So, for example, there are 2 billion people who are what we call first-line workers in the world, right? So they're working as retail specialists, or in the shop floor. The question is, in fact, to date, there has not been much of an investment even made in terms of at least information technology on their behalf. But for the first time, we're seeing, for example, whether it's the deployment of some communication tools, in our case, Teams, or even HoloLens, right? To be able to take somebody who joins a manufacturing plant and you want to really make that learning curve less steep, you give them a HoloLens, and their ability to guide their work drives their productivity. So to me, making investments like that is not only going to give wage support to these first-line workers, but also have them support your productivity gains as well. So to me, that's the type of work that I think needs to happen.
Surely at the moment, those people are being adversely affected by AI. Those first-line workers are exactly the sort of ones that people are thinking of.
For sure, the technology displacement and unemployment because of it is, you got to be clear-eyed. But let me first make the case even though for AI in what it can do to enable. First-line workers can be more productive. There is going to be automation. We'll come back to that. But take even 1 billion plus people in the world who have disabilities today. If you have visual impairment, AI can help you, in fact, interpret the world. If you have, you have dyslexia, you can read because of AI. So the idea that, in fact, AI can bring more people to fully participate in our economies is something that we shouldn't lose sight of. That doesn't mean, we should be not clear-eyed about the technological displacement. And that's where I think what we have to do with skilling. Like another example for me is, if we talk about AI skills being scarce, it's true. But what if we can democratize how people build applications? Something like more applications are going to get built in the next 5 years than the last 40 years. How is that going to happen? It's not because we're going to have that many software engineers. It's going to happen because domain experts are going to be able to use these low-code, no-code tools to build these applications. So skilling around that, it does require people to pick up new skills. And so I think we'll have to do some of our very best work in how people can pick up new skills, find that economic opportunity in new jobs, and because of the productivity gains that every business sees, to have better wage support for these jobs.
You talk about that, and that sort of ties into another thing, which I know you've been looking at, is the rather esoteric world of 19th century economists and people like David Ricardo and the whole theory of comparative advantage. From the point of view of running countries in the era you've just talked about, and many people would say Ricardo is the figure who underpins modern globalization. The idea that every country should be, or people should be good at one thing, and then you can openly trade it. What do you think that model is changing? Why did you get drawn to that?
I feel that the fundamental notion of comparative advantage is still very relevant for countries and companies. We have what we describe as a formula, so to speak, called tech intensity. So if you say, hey, how is the world going to grow at 5%, 6% again? It's going to grow because we're able to take that most malleable of resources that's now available, software, and apply it much more broadly. Each country gets to apply it in what is their comparative advantage. And the way you do it is even by adopting the latest and greatest technology, right? So you don't get stuck recreating the wheel. You get the maximum leverage. And then look to create your own proprietary digital technology in the industries, in the domains where you have comparative advantage.
Does that work in the developing world in the same way as it does in Silicon Valley or the City of London?
No, I do believe it applies. In fact, this is a great way for the developing world to, in fact, do catch-up growth. I mean, if you think about it, right? For all the talk of catch-up growth, take India. India did participate, came late because it was colonized, but was doing catch-up growth. But it's not been enough. It's not been sufficient. Whereas now, if you think about the India stack, right, which is really a digital infrastructure India has been able to build, that's pretty world-class. In fact, it can benefit many other parts of the world where that type of infrastructure building can, in fact, bridge even the lack of physical infrastructure. So I do believe that comparative advantage in the software world can be more exemplified, or in fact can be more accelerated.
Do you think that free trade is inherently unequal? I mean, especially at the top. The bigger the worldwide market, the greater the gains go to the people at the top of the people with the most skill, the most talent.
That's a great question. I mean, to me, we have to. This is where I think if you have very narrow celebration of economic growth, right? So when you don't have economic growth that is impacting all sectors, right? So when we say, oh, here's a GDP figure, you got to really dig behind it and say, is that, is the industrial production grown? Have the health outcomes gotten better? what has happened in the energy sector. So unless and until you can look at the broad sectoral economic growth and say in each region that's happening, if that is not happening, you are going to have these disparities.
But I suppose I'm just to push you on that. The idea, the technology you're pushing, the economic theories you believe in, many of us believe in them in this room, is that those almost inevitably tend to push towards the elite doing better because the worldwide market is so much bigger.
But again, it depends on how democratized. So if you think about, at least in the developed world or in the Western world, the dividends of the Industrial Revolution did actually get more equally distributed. So our dream, at least as a worldwide community, should be, in this fourth industrial revolution, can we say, oh, the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution can be more equally distributed?
And does that involve the government taking all those riches and distributing them?
Or in other words, to say, hey, what if every part of the economy is benefiting? Like, say, take even in the rural United States. If you had better access to broadband, if you had better access to healthcare, you had better agriculture, all of those were actually being impacted by latest and greatest in technology, just not Silicon Valley companies in the west coast of the United States or in the east coast of China, then I think everybody can participate.
On that issue, you mentioned the east coast of China and Silicon Valley. We now have a trade deal. Is that going to make life better between the US and China? You're right in the middle of that battle.
Look, I mean, I think all deals are good things. And to me, this first phase, in general, again, it goes back to any two countries should ask to make sure that they have deals that are really helpful to each of the countries. In other words,
are we worse off than we were before this whole process began?
It depends on whom, what does worse off mean, right? I mean, do we have more protections, for example, in our case, to intellectual property in this first phase? Yes. Do we think that this is sufficient? No. But is this progress? Yes. So to me, I think having more trade deals that both sides. To me, trade is all about both sides feeling like both sides can win, and more of that is, the better off we are as businesses because we get to be able to participate in that certainty.
But you've always been the sort of classic tech company that has invested in China. A lot of AI work is done there for you. Do you worry about the world splitting into two internets, into two systems? You can already see that a bit. You can see the divisions over Huawei.
I do worry a lot about that. But I would sort of say we also need maybe to develop a bit more sophistication in what does division mean even. Today there are big companies in China. The Chinese market and the Chinese internet has already in some sense developed outside of what we have in the rest of the world. So to some degree these separations already exist and maybe they will get amplified in the future. But perhaps more than any other time we do need more global norms, right? For example, take cybersecurity. It's not like you can truly isolate yourself in a world of cyber. If anything, we need more like the Geneva Convention of cyber so that all sides can come together to protect the most vulnerable populations in their own countries. Out of complete self-interest, you need more global norms around privacy, around security, around AI ethics even. So I would hope that in spite of whatever competitive dynamic or trade dynamic that causes people to separate out, we also recognize that we will all benefit even in that separation by having more global norms, not less.
You've described very accurately what it should be, but what it is at the moment, isn't it impacting every big tech business, including yours? There's a limit to how much you will want to invest in China as long as there is a potential barrier with America and the rest of the world.
I mean, in some sense, we in the tech industry perhaps, it's fascinating. I look back at it, right? I came to the United States in 1988. The Berlin Wall fell in 89. I joined the software industry in 90. And I think, wow, it's just like winning 3 lotteries in sequence. And because in some sense, the entire world was open to you. It was unfettered access to markets. And guess what? I mean, it's now we meet the reality of the world. So we in tech also have to sort of recognize that the world is a complicated place. There will be regulations. There will be restrictions around market access, and you have to just compete.
To what extent do you think Huawei is the sort of, the battleground for that? You see a number of countries, you mentioned cybersecurity, a number of countries, including most of America's allies, actually taking them in. You see America, Japan, Taiwan, a few countries saying no. There's a brilliant map on the Bloomberg website showing this sort of new tech Cold War. Do you think there is a way to reconcile the Huawei dispute?
I mean, we have to find a way to reconcile this because in some sense, today perhaps we conflate discussions around trade and trust. I think you have to separate the two. There has to be a way for any country to be able to trust through verification technology that they use as part of their infrastructure. In our own case, for example, we have created technology centers around, for example, Windows source code is something that you can inspect. In different parts of the world, we've been able to set up those centers so that governments all over the world can sort of really assure themselves about the security of the infrastructure they use. And I think mechanisms like that have to be in place. And that's where these global norms of being able to sort of say, what does trust in technology mean? And then build trade on top of it versus think of trade and trust as the same thing.
Isn't it exactly the opposite way around? Is that because you can't have any trust in the main governments to reach an enduring peace, you have to prepare for a world where there could be those two different systems.
True, that in some sense, trust in technology will only come if two governments have a mechanism to really trust each other.
And we're not at that situation at the moment.
We may not be, but we will need to seek our way in there. Because, see, today the supply chains are already so connected. So for the two countries to say that we are not going to go work this is just not something that's practical. You can take Huawei aside. There's lots of other parts of what is today's semiconductor supply chain that is pretty intermingled. And you have to find a way to sort of say, okay, what are we going to do about it? And to say that all you're doing is increasing the transaction cost for everybody if you completely separate.
Is there a particular bit that worries you in that dispute from a tech point of view?
I think that what worries me is that really at a time when this fourth industrial revolution, going back to sort of the questions you were asking me early on, where it can in fact help drive economic growth much faster in the next coming decades if we then take steps back in trust or increase transaction costs around technology. All we are doing is sacrificing global economic growth, which is not exactly, I think, the thing that any of us want.
Can I talk another thing which is linked to economic growth, but you lived through an earlier version of it. Microsoft originally, I think back in the 1990s, you were a young vice president back then. Still obviously very young. You had the big antitrust arguments about Microsoft. When you see what is happening about Google, Facebook, Amazon, what lessons do you learn from that period?
Going back to our own history, I think a couple of things come to mind, and some of the things that I talk a lot about, which is I always feel that from ancient sort of Greece to modern Silicon Valley, there's only one thing that brings anybody down. It's hubris. So I feel that there is a certain level of understanding of when there's a lot of people complaining about you, there must be some truth in it. And so therefore you should be able to look at the mirror and actually go and look at what your practices are and then actually work them.
And do you think there are particular bits of the tech market which need to be changed from a competitive viewpoint? Put aside the politics. You as a practitioner, as trying to be as fair as possible, do you think there are particular bits of the tech market that need to be changed from a competitive point of view?
I think that this thing that I said in the very beginning, which is I think there needs to be better understanding For example, even this entire vocabulary of network effects and digital feedback loops and network, basically externalities all came about because of our antitrust case in the late 90s. I think today, I feel that there needs to be a new vocabulary around this difference between even platform companies and aggregator companies. When I sort of see that how people even think about in fact, whenever I come to Europe, they call what I call aggregators platforms here. And I'm like, they're not platforms. There is, in fact, a very famous thing called the Bill Gates line, which is, as I said, if the value about the platform is more than the platform, that's how the platform stays stable, whereas aggregators don't need that. So I think there needs to be a deeper understanding.
Just quickly define what you think of which one fall in the platform?
But cloud computing is a pure platform. It's a one-sided market at the end of the day. There is network effects in the sense that there will be software developers who will write to a variety of clouds and people will use it. But still, in order for, say, the cloud vendor to do well, the customer who is actually using the cloud first has to do well to pay the bill. Whereas if you're a marketplace and you're aggregating, you can, in fact, be giving away on one side and then pricing. I mean, think about this. What does price competition even look like when things are getting priced in second-priced auctions? It's like how do you compete with something that has got a network effect and it's being priced as a second price auction? So therefore, I think we need a much better understanding of whether it's the search market or other markets which are advertising driven today. They have very different dynamics. I'm not saying one is good, one is bad. I just feel that they're just very different.
Do you trust government to come up with that solution? I mean, looking back at the Microsoft
That's
case,
their job.
Things moved very quickly.
The governments and regulators and antitrust authorities exist for that reason. And so, yes, they have to do their job.
And on a particular thing, you had this issue about the Defense Department contract, where you won it. Amazon then moaned that you'd won it because of Donald Trump intervening. You've had various moans from some of your people who work for you asking about that. Are you happy with that contract, and are you going to keep on doing stuff for the Defense Department?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been working with the Department of Defense in the United States, ever since the, Microsoft was created, and so therefore, we are very committed to it. We have, I think, an architectural lead in how we built the cloud, which is cloud plus the edge. We've really built a distributed computing fabric, which I think is going to be the architecture that Department of Defense needs it, and pretty much every business needs it. So in this next innings, we feel we feel very, very good about our competitive position. And yes, you'll win some contracts, you'll lose some contracts, but guess what? There's competition.
Do you think that politics is now sort of beginning to rule the tech industry? You've got that example in America, you've had issues, you've spoken out about India, you've got these issues to do with the Europeans taking quite combative rule towards the tech. Do you think that simple world that maybe you started in, where simply the best technology will win, has gone?
I mean, I just think that, we in the tech industry just have to mature to understand that, hey, look, we're very pervasive. I mean, technology is so much part of our lives in our industry that I think it just goes with the territory. Every other industry has had to deal with it perhaps a lot more in the past, and we will have to do so now.
Can I ask you about one last thing, which is quantum computing? Not easy to explain, but you're one of the people who've said, look, this is really beginning to change and really beginning to happen. This is a Year Ahead conference. Do you think that how would you gauge that? What is the best way of measuring how deep that effect will be? I mean,
it's interesting, given that even this, last week we made some commitments around our own obligations to, carbon emissions and reducing them and going carbon negative. Take this problem of if you want a catalyst that can absorb carbon from the atmosphere, that's a problem, that's a computational problem that can't be solved by the classical von Neumann machine today. So you need, in fact, you could claim a computational breakthrough in order to have the chemical breakthrough that then can help us solve our climate change issues. So yes, we need new type of computation. for all the sort of ubiquity of computation and availability of it, there are many challenges we still can't do. And so therefore, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, and we are investing a lot, so are many other research as well as private sector companies who are investing in it. We have put one of my sort of specific approaches is you need a general purpose quantum computer. So it's not like a special purpose quantum computer that even passes, although it's a pretty credible thing to do, which is a quantum supremacy test. You need enough qubits to be stable enough for long enough periods of time in order to be able to do what today's classical computers do. One interesting thing we've done in the last 2 years or so is put a quantum simulator on Azure. That means you can sort of take quantum-inspired algorithms and do interesting work on classical computers. And in fact, Cleveland Clinic took what was an algorithm, which is basically a search algorithm in a functional MRI, right? In order to find the tumors, there is a tissue signature. The accuracy of that is not something that you can solve in a classical computer. So the fact that you can, in fact, even simulate it is helping already make some gains, and therefore I'm excited about it.
And is there a kind of, do you think that quantum computing in the end will be spoken about as much as AI is?
Quantum computers will just create more AI. I mean, the way I look at it is AI is like how we talked about perhaps databases in the previous era to store data. AI is going to be the ability to reason over large amounts of data, is the runtime that is going to define the fundamental characteristic of software in the next decades to come.
Satya Nadella of Microsoft, thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg.
Thank you so much.